The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood as Sarah stepped into the desolate amusement park. Her breath came out in visible puffs, the chill of the night air biting at her skin. The faded remnants of bright colors, once vivid reds, yellows, and greens, now appeared as muted stains on decaying structures. The rusting skeleton of a Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its once proud wheels still, silent as a tomb. Sarah had come here for a reason. It wasn't curiosity alone that drove her. It was something darker, something personal. She had heard the stories, of course. The park was abandoned years ago after a series of bizarre incidents that no one ever spoke about. People had whispered of strange noises at night, of lights flickering in the distance, and of ghostly figures lurking in the shadows. Most wrote it off as superstition or local folklore, but Sarah knew better. She had to confront whatever haunted this place. There were memories here, memories she couldn't escape, and this park, this cursed ground, held the key. Her flashlight flickered as she walked down the cracked, weed-infested pathways. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, as if the park itself was watching her. The air felt heavier with every step, thick with the weight of years of abandonment. As she passed the crumbling remnants of a carousel, she could almost hear the faint sounds of music, a warped melody, distant and distorted, like the echo of a nightmare. She shook her head, trying to push the thought aside. "Get it together, Sarah," she told herself. "Hello?" she called out, her voice strangely small in the vast emptiness. There was no answer, only the soft rustling of dead leaves in the wind. Sarah had come alone, knowing it was the only way to truly understand what happened here. It had been years since the tragic event that had torn her family apart, and her mind refused to let go. Her brother, Jason, had disappeared here, swallowed by the darkness of the night, leaving behind only a faint trail of blood-stained footprints leading to nowhere. The police had searched for weeks, but all they found were rumors and whispers. The night Jason vanished, Sarah had been here with him. They had been young, full of life, exploring the world together, and then, in an instant, everything changed. She had heard his scream from the other side of the park, distant, frantic, a cry that still echoed in her mind every night since. But when she reached the spot, there was nothing, only the abandoned rides, the ghostly remnants of a place long past its prime. She had never stopped searching for him. And now, years later, the search was about to bring her face to face with the horrors she had tried to forget. A soft creaking sound echoed from the direction of the Ferris wheel. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Was it the wind? Or something else? She froze, her body tense, waiting for the next sound. She thought she heard something like a whisper, faint but unmistakable. She turned her head sharply, scanning the park, but saw nothing but the remnants of forgotten joyrides. Her breath quickened. This is insane, she thought. But she couldn't stop now. She had to find out what happened to Jason. If she couldn't make peace with this place, the weight of the years would crush her. Just as she stepped closer to the Ferris wheel, a loud bang echoed from the direction of the haunted funhouse. Sarah's eyes widened. It wasn't the wind, someone was here, and they weren't alone. Sarah's pulse raced as she turned toward the funhouse, her feet reluctant to move. The sound had been unmistakable, like a door slamming shut, the kind of noise that should have been impossible in a place so long abandoned. A part of her wanted to run, to flee from whatever presence lurked in the darkness, but another part, something darker, more determined, urged her forward. "I need answers," she thought, her fists clenching at her sides. The funhouse loomed ahead, its warped mirrors reflecting distorted images of the moonlight. The entrance was half hidden behind a tangle of vines and broken wooden beams, but it was still open, as if someone had recently passed through. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, the air thick with the musty odor of decay. The walls of the funhouse groaned in protest, and her footsteps echoed unnervingly through the narrow, twisting hallways. "Jason," she whispered, her voice barely audible, swallowed by the endless corridors. She wasn't sure if she truly expected him to answer, but she couldn't help herself. The name was like a lifeline, a tether to the memories of a happier time. The sound of her voice felt absurdly out of place in this place of horror, but it also gave her a strange sense of comfort. He had to be here, she thought. He had to be. The mirrors inside the funhouse were cracked, some shattered entirely, but Sarah found herself drawn to them. They seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though they were waiting for her to look into them. Her flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, the reflection she saw in one of the mirrors wasn't her own. It was Jason. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He reached out to her, his hand desperate and pleading. She gasped, stumbling backward, but when she looked again, the reflection was gone. Just a trick of the light, she told herself, trying to steady her breathing. Just the shadows playing tricks. But deep down, she knew something was wrong here. Something was watching her. A soft noise drew her attention to the far corner of the funhouse. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A low groan, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest and her body stiffened. Someone else is here, she thought. But who? And why? She took a step toward the sound, her flashlight sweeping the area. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in front of her, its shadows growing deeper, more oppressive. She could feel the temperature drop, the cold seeping into her bones as the footsteps grew louder. She wasn't alone. "Hello?" Sarah called, her voice shaking more than she cared to admit. "Who's there?" There was no answer, only the increasing sound of footsteps, the creak of old wood beneath someone's weight. Then, suddenly, a figure appeared at the far end of the hall. It was a man, hunched over, his movements jerky and erratic. His clothes were tattered, his face obscured by shadow, but Sarah felt an instant chill as he raised his head. His eyes, pale and hollow, locked onto hers. "Jason," she whispered, her voice cracking. The man did not respond. Instead, he slowly began to move toward her, his steps uneven, dragging across the floor with a disturbing slowness. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to run, but she stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the man's vacant stare. The air around her grew heavier, thick with the scent of decay, and her breath came in shallow gasps. As the figure drew closer, Sarah noticed something even more disturbing. The man's skin was cracked, as if the flesh beneath had begun to rot. His lips curled into a grotesque, hollow grin, and his hand reached out, fingers twitching as though trying to grasp at something just out of reach. "Please," Sarah whispered, her throat tightening. "What are you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, he stopped just a few feet away, and for a moment the two of them stood in silence, locked in an eerie standoff. The man's eyes bore into her soul, and in that instant, Sarah realized something terrifying. This wasn't Jason. This was something else, something that wore his face, his voice, but was not him. The cold, hollow presence before her was a twisted mockery of everything she had once known. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the shadows, his footsteps receding into the darkness. Sarah stood in the darkened funhouse, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the chill it left in its wake remained. The shadows seemed to stretch longer now, curling and creeping around her as if they were alive. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That man, thing, couldn't have been Jason. But the eyes, those vacant, hollow eyes, they had looked so familiar. She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself as if to ward off the cold that had settled deep within her bones. "Get a grip," she thought. "You're here for answers. Don't let this place break you." But the fear gnawed at her, deep and insistent, as the walls of the funhouse seemed to close in around her. The mirrors, once reflections of distorted reality, now felt like prison bars, trapping her in a maze of twisted reflections. She couldn't shake the feeling that the entire park was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to fall into the same trap her brother had all those years ago. A sudden noise shattered the silence, a creak from the far end of the hall. Sarah spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was followed by a low, guttural groan, like the moaning of something ancient and decayed. Slowly, she took a step toward the source, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her grip. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in tighter with every step she took. "Jason?" she whispered again, the name escaping her lips like a prayer. But there was no response, only the eerie silence of the park. Her mind raced, and for a moment she almost wished for the comforting certainty of the world she had left behind. Her life had once been simple, normal. But that had changed the moment Jason had disappeared. And now, as she ventured deeper into the heart of the park, it felt as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling around her. As Sarah approached the source of the sound, she saw a figure standing in the distance, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, hunched over, her face hidden beneath a tattered hood. The woman's movements were slow, deliberate, and every step seemed to echo in the silence, like a countdown to something terrible. The air around her shimmered, as if the very atmosphere was charged with an unnatural energy. "Who are you?" Sarah called, her voice wavering. "What do you want?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised her head, and Sarah froze. Her eyes, wide, glassy, and filled with a sorrow that pierced straight to Sarah's soul, locked onto hers. The woman opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, a sound like distant laughter echoed from her throat, low and mocking, like a cruel, twisted version of the joy that had once filled this park. The woman took a step forward, her feet dragging across the floor as though she were struggling to move. Sarah backed away, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to run, to escape, but her body refused to obey. The woman's eyes never left her, and with each passing moment, the sense of dread that had settled in Sarah's chest grew heavier. She could feel the weight of something ancient, something malevolent pressing down on her. Without warning, the woman lunged forward, her hand reaching out toward Sarah. The air seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy, and for the briefest of moments, Sarah saw it, the face. The woman's hood had fallen back, revealing a twisted, half-decayed visage that seemed to shift and distort in the flickering light. It was a face she recognized, her own. Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing as she fought to breathe. The woman's laughter filled the air, ringing in her ears like a bell tolling for the damned. She raised her flashlight, her hands shaking so violently that the beam wavered wildly. She tried to call out, to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The woman's face, her own face, twisted into a grotesque grin, and in that moment, Sarah realized the terrifying truth. This place didn't just reflect the past, it fed on it, it warped it. And now, the darkness had claimed her as well. The world around her seemed to tilt, the ground shifting beneath her feet. She was falling, spiraling into a void that felt both endless and suffocating. The laughter of the woman echoed in her mind, louder and louder, until it became a deafening roar. Sarah's body jerked violently, and the cold, relentless pull of the darkness dragged her deeper into the abyss. Sarah awoke with a start, gasping for air, her heart thundering in her chest. She was no longer in the funhouse. The walls, the mirrors, the laughter, gone. She was lying on cold, wet ground, her body stiff and sore. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, but there was no mistaking the source of her terror. She had fallen into the very heart of the park, a place long forgotten by the world, hidden deep beneath the surface. This was where it had all begun, where Jason had disappeared. The ground beneath her was uneven, covered in a thick layer of moss and vines. Sarah slowly stood up, her body unsteady, and tried to regain her bearings. The park stretched out before her like a broken dream, its once bright colors now swallowed by darkness. The Ferris wheel stood in the distance, a looming silhouette against the starless sky, and the sound of creaking metal drifted on the wind. It was as if the entire place had come alive, beckoning her to enter deeper. Her flashlight had fallen from her grip, its beam casting a weak light across the overgrown pathways. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she picked it up, and as she turned it back on, the faint light revealed a scene that made her stomach turn. The path before her was lined with old carnival tickets, their edges curled with age and moisture. Each one was marked with a number. Jason's number. She had seen it before. The very same ticket Jason had held in his hand the night he disappeared. A sound, low and distant, rumbled through the park. It was a hum, deep and resonant, like the thrumming of some vast, underground engine. Sarah's blood ran cold. The hum wasn't just a sound, it was a signal. The park was alive, and it had been waiting for her. She began to walk, though every step felt like an effort against the weight pressing down on her chest. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, suffocating in its intensity. The faint flicker of light from her flashlight revealed strange symbols carved into the trees, ancient markings that had not been there before. They seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and Sarah's mind raced to understand their meaning. Then ahead, she saw him. Jason, or something that looked like him. His face was gaunt, hollowed out by time and whatever horror had claimed him in this place. His eyes, once so full of life, were empty. The pupils dilated as though he were caught in a trance. He stood motionless, his body stiff as if suspended in time. But as Sarah moved closer, something shifted. His head turned, slowly, until his gaze locked onto hers. Sarah. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a rasp. The name seemed to echo in the air, hollow and distant. You shouldn't have come. Her throat tightened at the sound of his voice, the familiar pain of loss rising in her chest. This wasn't the brother she remembered. The Jason she knew would never have spoken in such a way. The words that followed felt like a confession, a warning. You didn't listen, he continued, his voice growing softer. You never listen. He stepped forward, and with each step, the world around him seemed to distort like a fever dream unraveling. The shadows stretched unnaturally, as if the very fabric of reality was warping. I never wanted to be here, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with grief and rage. I never wanted any of this. The words spilled out, raw and desperate. She had spent years searching for him, years trying to piece together the fragments of a night she could never forget. And now, standing before him, she realized that it was never about finding Jason. It was about escaping the nightmare. Jason's mouth twitched into a grim smile. You think you can escape it? He asked, his voice growing colder. This place doesn't let go. It feeds on the living, on the memories of those who linger. As the darkness deepened, Sarah's mind screamed for her to wake up. But she couldn't. The park was alive, and it had consumed her brother, just as it was consuming her now. The world around her seemed to implode, the walls of the park closing in, the ground beneath her trembling. The Ferris wheel creaked louder, the sound turning into a deafening roar, and then there was nothing. The sound, the vision, everything collapsed into a singular, terrifying moment of realization. She had been walking into the abyss for years, a pawn in a game she couldn't even understand. Sarah's flashlight flickered one last time before going out completely. The darkness that had swallowed the park now claimed her fully. But even as the shadows enveloped her, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had finally found him. And in the end, she too would become part of the park, trapped in the twisted memories that would never fade. Ryan Carter had always been drawn to the abandoned. His obsession with decaying places began as a young boy when he first stepped foot into the overgrown ruins of a nearby factory. The silence was deafening, the walls worn and cracked by time, but in the midst of the dilapidation, there was something undeniably fascinating about it. So when he heard about the Cypress Ridge Amusement Park, long since shut down after a series of strange accidents, he couldn't resist. The park was situated miles away from the nearest town, nestled in a valley that was difficult to access. Even the locals avoided it, talking in hushed tones about the bad things that happened there. Yet, Ryan was intrigued. He had researched it thoroughly, reading every scrap of history he could find, and it seemed that there was more to the park's closure than the police reports let on. Rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and a general aura of unease surrounded the place. Ryan's curiosity overpowered the warnings. One fateful evening, he packed a flashlight, his camera, and a notebook, and set off in the direction of the park. His car rattled down the dusty, winding road as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the thick woods that bordered the path. The trees seemed to close in on him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. As he turned a corner, the silhouette of the park's towering Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, a twisted, broken monstrosity that barely caught the last light of day. It was as if the park itself was waiting for him. When Ryan reached the entrance, the gates creaked on their hinges, as though disturbed by an unseen force. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He could hear the faint sound of something, or someone, moving inside. But when he turned to look, there was no one in sight. The laughter and shouts of children, once synonymous with the place, were now replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to stretch into infinity. "Maybe it's just the wind," Ryan muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his bones. He stepped through the rusted gates and into the park. The sound of crunching leaves beneath his boots, the only noise breaking the silence. The path was overgrown, with weeds growing in between the cracks of broken pavement. The once colorful signs for attractions had faded and peeled, their words unreadable. As if the park had been forgotten by time itself. As he ventured deeper into the heart of the park, Ryan began to notice strange details. The old carousel stood silent, its once vibrant horses frozen in place, their painted eyes dull and lifeless. A rusted roller coaster loomed in the distance, its tracks twisted and half collapsed. It was as though the park had been abandoned in an instant, its life snuffed out without warning. But Ryan wasn't easily deterred. He approached the carousel, feeling an odd pull toward it, as if something inside the park was calling to him. It wasn't until he reached the center of the carousel that he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned sharply, his flashlight sweeping across the area. There was nothing there, but the air was thick with tension. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, seemed to ride the wind. It was the sound of something, or someone, calling his name. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as the whisper lingered, chilling the very marrow in his bones. His eyes darted around, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. He was alone. Or at least, he thought he was. The overwhelming silence of the park made his every step feel louder than it should be, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Shaking off the unease, he turned away from the carousel and made his way toward the towering Ferris wheel in the distance. It was impossible to ignore the way its silhouette seemed to loom over the park, its broken gondolas swaying slightly in the wind as though they were still inhabited by some unseen force. Ryan couldn't explain why, but he felt an undeniable pull toward it. Maybe it was the grotesque beauty of its decay, or perhaps it was the unsettling promise of what might lie atop. As he approached the base of the Ferris wheel, he noticed a rusted ladder that led up to the platform where the operators once controlled the rides. The thought of climbing it made his stomach churn. But there was something about the height, the vertigo of being so high above everything, that beckoned him like an irresistible temptation. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but his curiosity, always his greatest weakness, pushed him forward. Ryan grabbed the first rung of the ladder and began his ascent, the rusted metal groaning beneath his weight. The wind howled through the broken framework of the Ferris wheel, and the higher he climbed, the more it felt as though the very air around him was thickening. He could almost hear the faint echo of the wheel turning, a low groan that reverberated through the steel structure. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and every step upward felt heavier, more deliberate. Halfway up, Ryan paused to catch his breath. From his vantage point, the park below looked even more desolate. The broken rides and overgrown paths shrouded in a shadow that seemed to swallow everything. It was impossible to shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. His heartbeat was loud in his ears, each thump resonating with a growing sense of dread. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, but his words did little to ease the tightening in his chest. When he reached the top of the Ferris wheel, he stepped onto the platform with a shaky sigh. The view was breathtaking in its own way, an endless stretch of darkened trees and forgotten structures, all bathed in the sickly glow of the moonlight. But it was also suffocating, as if the entire world beyond the park no longer existed. Ryan's eyes were drawn to the center of the wheel, where one of the gondolas hung at an odd angle. It was almost as though it was waiting for him. The chains that held it swayed slightly in the breeze, and for a moment it seemed as if the gondola were moving of its own accord, slowly turning in the wind. He could hear it creaking, the sound sharp against the stillness of the night. The chill of the air intensified, and a cold dread settled in his stomach. He stepped toward it, his boots scraping against the metal platform. His hands were trembling, but he couldn't stop himself. There was something inside the gondola, something that made his heart race and his pulse quicken. Ryan reached out and grasped the edge of the gondola, pulling himself inside. The moment his feet hit the floor, the wind seemed to die, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. He looked around, and that's when he saw it. A scrap of paper, yellowed with age, pinned to the seat. It read, "You shouldn't have come." Ryan's breath caught in his throat, the words sinking into his mind like poison. He tore his eyes away from the message, glancing nervously over his shoulder. There was a sudden, sharp snap in the air, and the Ferris wheels seemed to groan, the metal twisting in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It was then that he realized the terrible truth. The wheel wasn't just broken, it was alive, and it was watching him. The Ferris wheel groaned again, its twisted metal structure shaking as though it had been awakened from a deep slumber. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow and quick. The silence that followed felt suffocating, as though the park itself was holding its breath. His eyes darted around, searching for the source of the unsettling feeling that gripped him. The gondola swayed gently, almost as though urging him to leave, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the worn piece of paper pinned to the seat. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed in his mind, over and over again. They felt like a warning. But from what? The darkness around him seemed to close in, the once familiar surroundings now alien and menacing. Ryan's hand hovered over the edge of the gondola, trembling as he fought the impulse to climb out. But before he could make his decision, a low, guttural sound pierced the air, a sound so unnatural that it sent a chill racing down his spine. Ryan whipped his head around. There, standing at the base of the Ferris wheel, was a figure, draped in shadows, its face hidden in darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound beyond the faint rustle of fabric, but the weight of its presence was undeniable. Ryan's pulse quickened, a mix of fear and fascination gripping him. He couldn't see its face, but he felt as though it was staring at him, its eyes boring into his very soul. "Who's there?" Ryan called out, his voice trembling. But the figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. Ryan's eyes scanned the park once more, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it another person? Another thrill-seeker like him, exploring the abandoned park? But no, there was something off about the figure. It felt wrong. The air around it seemed to warp, like a distortion in reality itself. His heart began to race again as the figure slowly raised one arm, pointing directly at him. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The figure's hand was unnaturally long, the fingers too thin, stretching like taffy. It was as if the park itself had birthed this being, its existence as twisted and unnatural as the rusted rides and broken structures that surrounded it. For a moment, Ryan froze, paralyzed by the fear that had taken root deep within him. But then the figure took a step forward, and Ryan snapped into motion. His instincts kicked in, and he bolted from the gondola, his legs carrying him in a panicked sprint back down the rusted ladder. The world seemed to tilt around him as he descended, his heart pounding with every step. He didn't dare look back. As he hit the ground, he heard it, footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. Ryan pushed himself harder, his feet pounding against the cracked pavement, but the footsteps only grew louder, like a relentless echo. He glanced over his shoulder, but the figure had vanished. There was no sign of it, yet the feeling of being hunted lingered like a shadow, an inescapable presence. Ryan's breath came in ragged gasps as he veered toward the abandoned carousel once again. The sound of the footsteps seemed to fade, but the oppressive weight of the park, the feeling that it was alive, never left him. The faint whisper from earlier returned, louder now, as though the wind itself carried it. "You shouldn't have come." Panic surged in Ryan's chest as he turned to run in the opposite direction, but then he stopped dead in his tracks. The air had shifted, the temperature plummeting in an instant. His breath was visible in the cold night air, each exhale a mist that hung in the oppressive darkness. The park seemed to close in around him, the walls of twisted rides and broken attractions forming a maze he couldn't escape. Then the Ferris wheel groaned again, this time louder, as though something were pulling it, turning it, making it move of its own volition. Ryan's pulse quickened as he heard the sound of chains rattling and the creak of the wheel turning. He knew he had to leave. But where could he go? Before he could react, the earth beneath him seemed to tremble. A distant, haunting laugh echoed through the park, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. It was not human. It was something older, something that had been buried in the park for far too long. And now, it was awake. Ryan's heart slammed against his chest as the unsettling laugh echoed through the park. It wasn't a sound that belonged to any living person. It was far too distorted, too wrong. His body froze, his mind racing, struggling to comprehend what was happening. The very air around him seemed to thicken, suffocating him with a growing sense of dread. He had to get out. Now. His legs, once fueled by the adrenaline of panic, now felt like lead as he staggered toward the park's exit. Every step felt like a monumental effort, the oppressive darkness pushing against him, dragging him down. The distant sound of the Ferris wheel turning grew louder, as though the park itself were closing in on him, trapping him within its decaying walls. But when he reached the gates, they were no longer open. The rusted iron bars were shut tight, as though they had never been ajar. Ryan's breath hitched. No. His voice cracked in the stillness, but no one answered. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest trace of that laugh. It was close now, too close. Desperation clawed at him as he searched for another way out, but the park seemed endless, each turn leading him further into its labyrinth of rusted rides and overgrown pathways. The carousel, now illuminated by a sickly, flickering light, stood ahead like a twisted monument to forgotten joy. As he drew nearer, the distorted faces of the once beautiful horses seemed to watch him, their painted eyes now dull and lifeless. Their mouths were open, frozen mid-laugh, as if they were mocking him. He could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him again, slow and deliberate. He whirled around, but there was nothing there. The park was silent once more. Yet Ryan knew something was watching him, something old, something malevolent. The whisper returned, louder this time. You shouldn't have come. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the park. It was a voice, cold and cruel, speaking directly into his mind. His legs moved without him thinking, carrying him deeper into the park. His eyes were wide with fear, darting around, searching for any escape, but there was none. The park had become a maze, and the more he tried to find his way out, the more lost he felt. The walls seemed to shift, the path bending and twisting as though the very ground beneath him was alive. Ryan stumbled upon the old funhouse, its warped mirrors reflecting distorted versions of himself. He stepped inside, drawn by the eerie glow of flickering lights. The mirrors were cracked, their surfaces warped and broken, reflecting grotesque, monstrous versions of his own face. His reflection grinned at him in a way he didn't, its eyes wide and unblinking. Its smile stretched too far across its face. He recoiled, but his reflection remained, staring back with an almost mocking expression. The air inside the funhouse was thick with a musty scent, and the sound of creaking wood echoed in the distance. He stepped deeper into the maze of mirrors, his pulse racing as the reflections of himself multiplied. But then something caught his eye. A shadow moved within one of the mirrors, not his own reflection, but something else. Something, watching him. He spun around, his flashlight shaking in his hand, but there was nothing there. The shadow had disappeared, leaving only the cold emptiness of the funhouse behind. But Ryan knew what he had seen. He couldn't deny it. He wasn't alone. His mind raced, his thoughts a blur of confusion and fear. The park had become its own entity, a living nightmare, and Ryan had unwittingly become a part of it. He had come seeking answers, hoping to uncover the truth behind the park's abandonment, but the truth was far darker than he had ever imagined. The park wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed. The laugh returned, louder this time, coming from all directions. It was everywhere. And then Ryan heard another sound, one he hadn't heard before. The soft scraping of something moving across the ground, dragging itself closer. A shadow emerged from the darkness, and for the first time, Ryan saw it clearly. The figure from earlier, the one that had been watching him, was no longer just a shadow. It was real, a grotesque, twisted version of a human being, its limbs too long, its body contorted in unnatural ways. Ryan screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the laughter that surrounded him. The figure lunged forward, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and Ryan stumbled backward, his body colliding with the sharp edges of the mirrors. His mind spun, his body unable to comprehend the horror unfolding before him. In that moment, Ryan understood the cost of his curiosity. The park wasn't just a forgotten place. It was a prison for lost souls, for those who had dared to uncover its secrets. And now, he was one of them. As the figure reached out, its twisted hands closing around his throat, the world around Ryan seemed to darken. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the park was still. The Ferris wheel stopped turning, the lights flickered out, and the wind died down. But Ryan wasn't there anymore. Dylan Hayes had always been drawn to the forgotten places, those tucked away from the eyes of most. As a photographer with an obsession for abandoned locations, he had spent years documenting crumbling buildings, rusting factories, and the remnants of lives once lived. Yet, none of his previous excursions had prepared him for the eerie allure of what lay in wait on the outskirts of town. The Longwood Amusement Park. The park had been closed for over 2 decades, abandoned after a tragic fire left its rides smoldering in the midnight hours. Local rumors circulated that the fire wasn't an accident, that something dark had been behind it, something more than just faulty wiring or poor maintenance. But to Dylan, those were just rumors, echoes of fear clinging to the past. He wasn't afraid, he was curious. And curiosity, in his mind, was a fire far more dangerous than any he had ever photographed. The moment Dylan passed through the rusted gates, he felt a strange pull. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, damp earth, and a faint chemical tang that seemed to hang in the air like an unseen fog. The ground stretched out before him, swallowed by overgrown weeds and tangled vines. There was no sound, no wind, no birds, no hum of distant traffic. Just silence. And yet, it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence that might soothe the soul. It was the kind of silence that made his skin crawl, like something was watching, waiting. He shook the feeling off. His flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the dilapidated Ferris wheel that loomed in the distance. Its rusted frame creaked in the windless night. And Dylan couldn't help but wonder if the metal was alive, groaning under the weight of its own history. He snapped a picture, the flash momentarily illuminating the forsaken rides, casting twisted shadows that made the once joyous park seem almost alive again. As Dylan walked deeper into the park, he noticed the remnants of the old carnival booths, shattered windows, the rotting remnants of faded prizes, and cracked pavement where games of skill had once been played. He couldn't help but think of the children who had once wandered these grounds, laughing and shouting as they won stuffed animals and cheap trinkets. But that joy felt like a distant memory, a memory long buried beneath layers of decay. He paused at the edge of the old roller coaster track. The cars sat motionless, unmoving, their paint chipped and faded. It was almost as if the ride had been frozen in time, waiting for passengers who would never arrive. But there was something unsettling about the stillness of it all. The world around him had an unnatural quality to it, as if time had stopped the moment the park was abandoned. Even the shadows felt wrong, too dark, too long. Suddenly, there was a sound, a faint, scraping noise, like something dragging across metal. Dylan froze, his heart skipping a beat. He swung the flashlight toward the source, but there was nothing there. The silence returned, heavier than before. He was alone, or at least he thought he was. Dylan's pulse quickened as he stood motionless, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his grip. He had to have imagined it. The park was a graveyard of forgotten memories, nothing more. But the scraping noise had been real. He was certain of it. His eyes scanned the darkened pathways, but there was no movement, no sign of life. Still, the feeling of being watched gnawed at him. He shook his head, trying to shake off the dread creeping up his spine. "It's just the wind," he muttered to himself, though the words didn't comfort him. The air felt too still. The park had an oppressive weight to it, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Dylan stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the old funhouse. A looming structure at the heart of the park, its once bright paint now peeling and faded. There was something about the building that unsettled him more than the rest of the park combined. The windows were broken, jagged shards of glass reflecting the pale light from his flashlight, giving the place an eerie, almost sinister quality. It was a place designed for fun, for laughter, but now it seemed like a tomb, a hollow shell of what it once was. He reached for the rusted door handle, which groaned under his touch, but as soon as he pushed it open, a gust of cold air rushed out, smelling faintly of old cotton candy and burnt popcorn. Dylan recoiled instinctively, the scent both nostalgic and unsettling. He stepped inside, his light flickering momentarily before steadying. The shadows within the funhouse stretched like twisted fingers, and the walls, once adorned with whimsical mirrors and painted scenes of happy clowns, now revealed only decay. The floor was cracked, the walls stained with time's cruel passage. Dylan's footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. He wasn't sure why he had come in here, but the sense of unease tugged at him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. As he moved further, he noticed a faded sign on the wall, a remnant of its glory days. "Welcome to the House of Wonders." The irony of it wasn't lost on him. Now it seemed more like a house of horrors. He turned a corner, and then froze. The mirror in front of him was cracked, but it wasn't the reflection of the shattered glass that caught his attention. It was the shape, something in the reflection that wasn't in the room with him. A figure, a shadow. It was standing just behind him, too still to be real, too solid to be just a trick of the light. Dylan's breath hitched in his chest, and he spun around. The room was empty. He was alone, or so he thought. A faint whisper, a soft murmur, drifted from the corner, barely audible, like the wind carrying words long forgotten. Dylan's heart pounded in his ears, and he slowly turned back to the mirror. There in the glass, the figure was now closer, its shape more defined. A face, pale, hollow eyes, a grin that was more grotesque than anything he had ever imagined, and just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanishing into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. Dylan stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from his grip as his hands began to shake. He tried to steady himself, but the room seemed to close in around him, the walls pushing in like the jaws of some unseen beast. His breath became shallow, panic rising within him. He had to get out. But when he reached for the door, it was no longer there. The once open exit was sealed, the walls shifting and contorting as though the very building was alive. A voice, low, distorted, like it was being dragged through water, whispered his name. Dylan. The voice echoed around him, as though the very air in the room had shifted to carry the words. Dylan's name, pulled and distorted by some unseen force, clung to him like a curse. His heart thundered in his chest, a rhythmic pounding that drowned out all other sounds. The walls, now groaning and creaking under pressure, seemed to close in tighter with every breath he took. He fumbled for the door, his fingers slick with sweat, but there was nothing. No exit. No escape. He took a step back, eyes darting around the room, desperate for a way out. His flashlight still lay on the floor, casting an eerie glow across the cracked mirrors and shattered remnants of the funhouse. But the air felt wrong, oppressive, as if the building itself was alive and watching him. The whisper came again, but this time it was closer, much closer. He could feel the breath on the back of his neck, cold and damp like a chill rising from the earth itself. His hair stood on end as he spun around, but again, there was nothing, only the distorted reflections of himself, his face twisted and fragmented by the jagged shards of glass. But the mirrors, they didn't reflect him the way they should. They were showing things that didn't belong. In one, a dark figure stood, its face obscured by shadows. In another, there was a fleeting glimpse of a child, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes. The child was staring at him, unmoving. And in the farthest mirror, a faint but unmistakable outline of something slithering, crawling just beneath the surface of the reflection. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. Dylan. The voice, this time a rasping whisper, was almost a growl now. Don't leave. You're not done here. He stumbled backward, his hands trembling as he tried to steady himself against the wall. Sweat dripped down his face and his breath came in shallow gasps. He couldn't make sense of what was happening. This wasn't supposed to be real. The supernatural wasn't his thing. He'd never believed in ghosts or spirits, not in any meaningful way. But now, standing in the heart of this rotting amusement park, he could feel the weight of something far darker than he had imagined pressing down on him. The mirrors weren't just reflections anymore. They were windows into something else, something that was reaching out, pulling him in. A cold wind swept through the room, and Dylan's flashlight flickered once more before dying entirely. Darkness swallowed him whole, but the air was heavy with the scent of something burning, cotton candy, popcorn, something sweet and cloying. The kind of smell that made you sick, the kind of smell that reminded you of days that were long gone. Suddenly, the floor beneath him gave way with a deafening crack. He fell to his knees, his hands scraping against the rough surface, but there was no real pain, only a sense of vertigo, as though he was being pulled into some deeper, darker place. The shadows around him seemed to stretch and writhe like tendrils, and the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. "Come, join us. Join the forgotten." He felt a tug on his leg, something cold and clammy wrapping around his ankle. He tried to pull away, but it was as though the shadows themselves were holding him down, dragging him into the depths of the floor. Panic surged through him, breath coming in ragged gasps as he clawed at the ground. He had to get out. He couldn't stay here. Not with whatever it was lurking just beneath the surface. But as he struggled, a memory surfaced in his mind, something he hadn't thought about in years. A conversation he had overheard as a child, one that had stayed with him all these years, buried deep in his subconscious. His father speaking to someone in hushed tones. "They say the place is cursed. The fire wasn't the worst of it. The real horror was what happened afterward. No one who goes in ever comes out the same." The darkness around him pulsed with malevolent energy, and Dylan realized, with a sickening twist in his gut, that the whispers were not just voices from the past. They were the echoes of the park itself, of those who had been lost within it, and perhaps of something far worse. "Dylan." The voice was almost a plea now. "Help us." Dylan's heart slammed in his chest, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps as the darkness pressed in around him. The cold fingers of shadow wrapped tighter around his ankle, pulling him deeper into the floor's cold, merciless grip. He had no strength left to fight it, no strength left to resist the overwhelming pull. He could feel himself sinking, the weight of the unseen force dragging him into the depths of something ancient and far worse than any nightmare he could ever imagine. "Help us," the whisper came again, pleading, aching. But now it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, a collective of voices, soft, hoarse, cracked with time. "You must understand, we were all part of it." Dylan's mind reeled as the words wrapped around his sanity like a vice. We were all part of it. What did that mean? What were they talking about? Was this some kind of trap? The park, the fire, the shadowy figures that had haunted him. Was it all connected? His thoughts scrambled for clarity, but they were drowned out by the overwhelming darkness. He reached for anything to break free from the suffocating grip of the shadows, but his hands were shaking uncontrollably. The floor beneath him seemed to melt away, like he was slipping into a void, a place between the living and the dead. He could feel the weight of the years pressing down on him, the weight of those who had been lost here, their souls twisted and trapped in the dark, their restless energy clinging to him like 1,000 unseen hands. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered back to life, its beam slicing through the darkness. For a moment, the shadows seemed to recoil, as though they were afraid of the light. And in that instant, Dylan saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the room. Not a shadow this time, but a person, pale and gaunt, their face twisted with an expression of deep sorrow and anguish. It was a woman, dressed in tattered carnival attire, her eyes hollow, sunken into her skull, as if the very life had been drained from her. She stared at him, her lips moving silently. Though no words came from her mouth, Dylan could hear her voice in his head, clear as day. "Don't stay," she whispered, her voice a soft, mournful warning. "You're not meant to be here. You have to leave before it's too late." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't trust this, couldn't trust her. But even as he tried to back away, the shadows seemed to pull him back, the unseen hands dragging him further down. His mind screamed for him to run, to escape. But no matter how much he struggled, no matter how hard he tried to fight it, the pull grew stronger. And then, like a spark igniting a fire, a memory burst to the forefront of his mind. The fire, the night it had all started. the night the park had burned down. He had heard the stories, the rumors of something darker lurking beneath the surface, something that had caused the fire. It was more than just an accident. It was a curse, something that had taken root in the very bones of the park. He saw the woman again, her eyes locked onto his, filled with an unspoken understanding. The curse? It had never truly died. It had lingered, festering, waiting for the right moment to consume anyone who dared to return. And now Dylan realized he was a part of it. The very thing he had come here to capture. The truth behind the park's tragedy was the very thing that would seal his fate. With a final, desperate cry, he lunged for the door, his hands clawing at the air as he tried to break free. But the shadows closed in on him like a wave crashing over the shore, relentless and unforgiving. His body was consumed by the darkness, and with a final scream, his vision went black. The next morning, the park stood silent, abandoned as it always had been. No sign of Dylan Hayes. No sign of the photographer who had ventured into the long-forgotten amusement grounds. The wind howled through the overgrown weeds, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter, distant and hollow. The Longwood Amusement Park was as it had always been, a place of memories long lost, of stories untold. But somewhere, deep within the shadowy ruins, a new story had begun to unfold, one that would be whispered in the dark for years to come.